Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're caffeinated and refreshed for our fascinating next couple of sessions. We brought together some of the most interesting kind of voices on the impact of politics on reform. And it has been known, even in a country as well organized as Ukraine, that politics can get in the way of reforms. This will come as news to none of you. We've had your introductions, but just if you're at the back, I would love it if you came and shared some of the space a bit further forward, because our panelists do get lonely and they're a shy bunch. But more to the point, if you could really come into the room and sit down soon, what incentive can I give you? If you do that, you get your lunch earlier. So please just come and join us so that we can get underway, and just a little bit of quiet for our panel. Just so you can see exactly where they are. You've heard the introductions, but Dmytro is at the far end, Alexander, Kateryna, and Lajos, Bokros next to me. Can I just ask you to just sit down? Yeah, thank you very much. The last stragglers. I promise we will keep to time and let you out to chat at lunchtime. So, will politics prevent progress reforms in an election year? You have an exciting election, of course, coming up within the year in Ukraine. You have had difficult and changeable politics, but also that commitment to reform with many externalities which have proved extremely difficult for the country. We're going to look first at what might be lying in the way of that, and I'd like the panel to be as frank as possible. No hedging your bets. We deserve the full truth and nothing but the truth. And then we'll take the investment view in the second part of our session, where you can actually go away and put a price on it. So let's start, perhaps. Dmytro, why don't you kick us off? Dmytro, former Deputy Head of the Presidential Administration, Secretary of the National Reforms and Investment Council. Your take on how we go through this next year?
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you organizers for actually continuing doing this event in a very turbulent time, but also promising time for Ukraine. I will be speaking in my previous capacity and my new capacity is business and pharma industry. So when we're talking about the reforms, and if we try to look at what has happened over the last year, we look in a perspective what happened from previous year, same conference, same time, and today. So I will try to go through a few things which are business related and gives you a bit of insight what actually happened. So first, there was an introduction of new regulation and new transparency and corporate governance to the limited liability companies, new structures, board instruments, a lot of things that give a lot of opportunity for investors and flexibility of investment. The new privatization law, which gives an interesting perspective about arbitrage and use English law as a guidance for all the privatization deals. And it's not just the law being signed, the first tenders, online tenders to privatized property already started, sometimes tripling the price of initial bid. We got 4G launched, and we not just launched, we got money to the state budget, but we also have it functioning. But I think Alexander can give a better glimpse on this. But it's, again, just a year. Probably one of the biggest achievements that's not been done for more than 20 years is liberalization of the currency regulation. It's a law which is in place, and starting from the February, we're going to see tremendous changes in action for a lot of investors and a lot of opportunity for the business here. We got the first National Investment Councils taking place with almost $1 trillion all-up company sitting at the table, which already leads to some interesting developments in terms of investment and practical things taking place in Ukraine today. But if we look further what actually did happen, and it's always indication is the businesses that comes in Ukraine and doing business. It's a topic of the next panel, but it's also related to my current role. And so what happened over the last year, they had famous rocket players, those who play tennis knows that, or who doing diving knows it. So the big skiing factory will be built in Vinnytsia. And a decision done and investments coming in place. General Electric, the big deal about the production of locomotives is also taking place during this year. Monsanto opened their big new seeds plant. H&M opening stores. IKEA opening stores. We are in Odessa, and in a few, I think, believe that final opening of TIS and Cargill here in Odessa port will take in place this autumn, and the first step already took place. So this is indication of what has happened in Ukraine over the last year. But at the same time, when people say, well, elections, what really happened over the just last months? We expecting the voting on the concession law on the second reading. We passed, the parliament passed the law on the open data for exploration companies, so there is putting more transparency for the businesses that is involved in the explorations. It's open data, and the initiative of Ministry of Finance, particularly putting not just the whole transaction of the state online, but also the state budget with the whole detailization and BI behind this. So it's already happened this year. Now, elections. Elections is always elections. It doesn't matter if it's Ukraine, United States, European states, you will always have a discussion, battling of ideas and proposals. And this will, of course, have an influence on the things happening in the parliament. But we still have, I think, the biggest indication of the pro-reform ideas will happen with the approval of the state budget, cooperation with IMF going on the right track, and we will probably hear soon good announcements. And then from the business perspective, if you look on the business perspective, all industries, almost all industries are growing double digits. Pharma double digits, consecutive years, IT double digits, agri double digits, and a lot of perspective. So there is much more optimism in what's happening in Ukraine, and that's why I made a decision to go into the business, because there is much more opportunities and much more return on investments in the business today. It's a time to invest. And the government and the politician have the very decisive focus. President spoke today in the parliament with very strong support for the voting on the definition of North Atlantic and European integration of Ukraine as a part of constitution.
Dmytro, I'm going to cut you off there
Sure.
just because we can dive back into that and possibly even test some of your bold assertions. But are you happy just to leave there as the one very final short point you want to make? I think 5 minutes each on this round, panel.
Sure. I think I would rather leave my 1 minute
leave us
for next
wanting more. Always
conversation.
leave this audience wanting
Thank you.
more, because they're a very demanding bunch. So, that was a pretty upbeat assessment of where Ukraine is in this time as we head up to the election. Alexander, why don't you take over from there? Alexander, as you will know, is chairman of the National Commission for State Regulation, Communications and Information. Big long title, lots under your belt.
Yes. Hi. Hello. Hello. My name is Alexander, and I'm head of telecom regulator. The most notable things that has been happening in the market were, of course, 3G and 4G tenders. We held 3 tenders for the spectrum. And I must say that this was the first time this country has seen a transparent tender for spectrum. Spectrum is a limited resource, just like oil and gas. And as I said, this is the first time this country has seen transparent tenders, and the first time that the budget, the state, has seen significant inflows into the coffins. And the industry has demonstrated the growth and support for these tenders. Coming back to the theme of this panel, will the politics prevent reforms? Let's just say that any democratic country has a plan to hold elections once in 4 or 5 years. And this is exactly what is happening, because as Dmytro has said, many things have been done, and many things are still yet to be done. And any society has to choose and has to reconsider and has to regroup itself to come forward yet again. Because if you look at the statistics of voting in the parliament, many important laws have been passed by a very narrow margin. This means that the parliament, as a reflection of society, has a lot of discussions within it. And we all know in 2014 and 2015, it all started with the plans and with a broad coalition, and then many different things happened. So I think, coming back to the theme of this panel, that what is happening is very normal and very good, so that the society and the parliament and we as people have an opportunity to reconsider what is happening, and much attention to be paid to what are these elections for and what are the election plans of the politics in the coming years.
It's all sounding like heaven on earth in Ukraine politics at the moment. So, but I'm going to sort of press a little bit on that, and I'm also going to try and come to you for a couple of well-targeted questions, audience. So if there's one up your sleeve and you might have a couple of challenges to what you've heard, then I'd quite like to hear them. You live the perspective of the central bank. This is, a period of potential opportunity, but also there is potential for turmoil as the parties fight it out. We've seen some changes in the government, a different finance minister. Well, sometimes when I come, there's a new one. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen next year. Do you find this a sort of stable enough environment in which to do your job?
Доброго дня всім. По-перше, дуже дякую організаторам за можливість бути тут і поділитися нашим баченням. Мені, напевно, найважче говорити про політичні якісь речі, тому що ми є незалежним центральним банком і поза політикою. Що я хочу сказати, і Дмитро дуже багато про це вже говорив, за останній рік чи за останні роки було зроблено дуже багато. І з точки зору Національного банку, мені здається, що найбільшим досягненням це для країни, для бізнесу, для подальшого просування реформ в усіх абсолютно сферах – це є досягнення макрофінансової стабільності. Ми зробили це в дуже важкий час. Ми перейшли до режиму інфляційного таргетування, ми перейшли до режиму плаваючого чи гнучкого обмінного курсу, що дозволило нам сьогодні і прийняти закон про валюту, який фактично відкриває для бізнесу шалені можливості для розвитку. На сьогоднішній день завдяки подоланню дуже високої інфляції ми створили умови для подальшого, для імплементації і реформ в усіх абсолютно сферах. І, відверто кажучи, можна перераховувати дуже багато надбань, які було зроблено, але мені здається, що сьогодні це вже є незворотній шлях. І так дійсно, передвиборний період Україна нічим не відрізняється від інших країн. Але це не значить, що щось повинно загальмуватися. Мені здається, що наше завдання сьогодні – продовжити імплементацію тих реформ, продовжити розбудову тих сфер, які були розпочаті, і зробити це якнайкраще, заклавши підвалини для майбутнього розвитку країни і економіки.
Thank you very much there, Kateryna. Lajos Bokros, former Minister of Finance in Hungary, so no stranger to carrying out reforms in politically fraught circumstances, now Professor at the CEU. And also, you don't have to kind of, you can just talk about the way you see it, really. Is this kind of really such a golden and stable position for Ukraine, or what are the challenges that you would lay out to your fellow panelists?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a special privilege and pleasure to be here again as a non-Ukrainian in the panel. All I can say in this very, very short period which has been allocated to me is that the future of Ukraine is in Europe. We very much want Ukraine to join the European Union in the next 10 years or so. I think whatever government you may choose in the next parliamentary elections and also the presidential elections, because the two things are very much interrelated here in Ukraine, the important thing is not to forget about the major national goal, and I think behind that there is a national unity, despite policy differences. that Ukraine should belong to Europe. That means many things, among others. In a small open economy, for example, it means that there is no such a thing as sustainable economic growth and long-term development without the rule of law. It's an important bridge between what we call policy and politics. Without a full-fledged liberal democracy, there is no rule of law. And without rule of law, there is no such a thing as sustainable development in a small open economy. I emphasize small because we all know size does matter. We have learned that from Godzilla. In certain countries, and we heard about some of them before in this conference already, there might be, even in the long run, some kind of a mobilization of national resources, both material and financial, both spiritual and scientific, to have long-term development, or rather longish-term sustainable growth. In Ukraine, forget about that. Don't even think for a second that this country can have a dirigist government in order to flourish in an extremely competitive global market environment. Now, can politics prevent policy, good policy? Can politics prevent reforms? Of course it can. And not only that, but it can reverse reforms. Look no further than some of your neighboring countries, like Poland and Hungary, where populist nationalist governments are there to try to reverse many of those market-orientated reforms, which made these countries very successful in the first place, in the first phase and first period of what we can call transition. Now, these policies might be popular for a while, but it's a dead-end street. Because if you destroy checks and balances, which constitute the backbone of what we call rule of law, then sooner rather than later it would undermine the sanctity of private property. It would also destroy the judiciary system, which is absolutely key in terms of enforcing contracts. Then governments will like their bodies and shower them with privileges and preferences, and all the others will get nothing but punishment. So then the market, as we know it in a competitive manner, will be destroyed also. And then there will be no investment, no jobs, no development. So I think as an introduction, this is probably enough.
It's a very good introduction and quite a few challenges there for the rest of the panel. I mean, the question that I want to throw in is that the politics are very changeable, that if we look now, and admittedly we're a long way out from the election, that there is certainly a challenge to the incumbent, and that will obviously create some sense of instability or uncertainty for investors. So in as much team as you could take off your government T-shirts, so to speak, not literally, Dmytro, how are you reading this race at the moment? We're seeing Yulia Tymoshenko come back, heading the polls, albeit by a small margin in quite chaotic polling. But this is a difficult position, is it not, for Mr. Poroshenko?
Before this, there was one case I didn't mention that happened and been resolved during the last year, which has been pending for years, and especially in this type of meetings with this type of folks, the topic of Mria case being one of the top one in the discussion. I've heard the issue of Mria starting from 2014, 15. I want to thank you big time, ICU, Makar, Roma, for actually stepping in and making sure and representing and helping bondholders to actually resolve it. It's been a big story and a big question mark on Ukraine, particularly this one. And again, the question about ability of the state to protect investors, ability of the rule of law to protect investors, and there was a lot of efforts on the toppest level and it's been resolved through the work, and Alexei Pavlenko probably will mention this, the resolution and bringing a strong investor into this. So this is a big win for Ukraine from trusting of investors. Now about the question.
To the election. Now to the exciting bit.
No, they're going to. So, if you look at the polls today, there is still a big room for uncertainty in terms of who will run. Talking to a lot of experts, it's too early to do any predictions. Things in Ukraine show that winds can swing, and the question that we for sure know that the pro-Western candidate will win election. This has been seen through the polls. If we previously had a 50-50 split, today is 65-35, 65 in favor of pro-Western candidate. Who end up in the final, or the second round of the president election, it's still a question mark, but it's definitely that we will have a pro-Western candidates winning. Depending how things and the creativity of the teams, we'll see a different narratives, but already we see Yulia Tymoshenko copy-pasting the statements from President Poroshenko. We already see that almost everybody is talking about Western integration, support of NATO, etc. So, net-net, the new president or the person who will be in the presidential position will continue focusing on the pro-Western vector of Ukraine, because there's a lot of things to be implemented. Considering the parliamentary election, that will be, we'll see a lot of dispersed presence in the parliament, I believe, which will require a lot of consolidating efforts to put together a strong coalition government.
Do you see any chance of a referendum when you talk about Western orientation? And everyone knows that there is a kind of competition going on there between Poroshenko and Tymoshenko on that front, that one way that one candidate could take a risk on it, but give themselves greater profile, would be to say, right, let's have a referendum on EU membership or indeed on NATO membership.
I think that a referendum is a very unfruitful way of understanding what's going on. I think the polls indicate a strong preference for European integration of the majority. NATO is already hitting 60+ favor. And the referendum, we have a story of United Kingdom with a lot of interesting referendums, and now the question of a second referendum. So I'm not really a big fan of referendums. I think it's a question of the political elite to move forward and stay on the path and being backed up by opinion of the citizens. And that's what we see today is a pro-Western coalition and the pro-Western movement. The forms, the discussion, the actions will be different. We'll see how each candidate present their proposals on actions, but I don't see any deviation from the vector that majority of Ukrainians would like to see.
Thank you. Alexander, are you reading that the same way, that there will be, if you like, small differences between the lead candidates, but that overall the orientation remains the same, or are there more nuances here? Whoops. Are you back in business?
Hello? Yeah. I would compare elections to well, if you are a shareholder in a business, you select your CEO based on what are the tasks ahead and based on the track record. And this is exactly what is happening. Now, the people of Ukraine, us, has a chance to compare every candidate against what are we willing to do, what are we hoping for, and against what has been done and what is the track record of any candidate. And I think this is where the answer is, that every one of us has to reflect on what has been done and what is yet to be done, and which candidate is better positioned to do that. And this is very, very similar to the business-like decisions that any of businessmen that are here are doing on a year-to-year basis.
Some businesses do change the CEO, however.
Sorry?
Some businesses do change their CEO.
Well, yes, and those decisions are based on how the business owners consider the track record and the tasks ahead. And then if you think that the track record is insufficient, and if you think that another candidate has a better track record, then you change the CEO. But this is up to the people to decide.
Of course it is, but I'm asking your opinion.
My opinion, I am just one of 40 million of people.
Well, you're the one we've got on the panel now. What do you think? Let me try and put it another way. Your loyalty is very clear. What do you think the key question should be then for those, let's say, for the top candidates, the ones who will really end up driving this campaign?
Well, the top issues are, everyone is aware of. And, we've seen many good things happening. We've seen things that have been stalled. And as I said, if you look at if you talk about reforms, it's more of a question of the ability of the parliament to pass laws. And we hear and we see that there's a lot of discussions are happening on the land reform. A lot of discussions are happening on the continuation of the pension reform, and many other things. And if you're looking to see who is the better position to carry on forward, you'll have to look at the track record, and this is the answer to the question, I think.
Okay, Kateryna, what would you hope would be clarified in the discussion around the election and election campaigning, and from your point of view as a policymaker at the central bank, what are the risks of election year? What would you not like to see happen?
Напевне, мене чути. Дуже багато говорять про ризик фіскального домінування. І я би, напевне, не говорила про якихось конкретних кандидатів, але популізм, який ми чуємо сьогодні від багатьох з них, слід розцінювати як той ризик, який дійсно сьогодні є. Але, що би я хотіла сказати як представник Центрального банку? Ви розумієте, дуже багато змінилося, і коли я говорю про те, що незважаючи на передвиборчий період, незважаючи на ті іноді незрозумілі гасла, які ми чуємо, чому ми не повинні боятися, що реформи можуть бути зупинені або навіть розвернуті в інший бік? Ну, по-перше, як говорили вже мої колеги, країна визначилася із своїм вектором, із своїм шляхом. Країна – це ми з вами, в першу чергу. І ми розуміємо, що ми рухаємося до Європи, до Євросоюзу, до найкращих стандартів, не тільки законодавчих, управлінських, до найкращих стандартів життя. Що ми сьогодні зробили і чого досягли? І чому ми не боїмося популістів? Тому що фіскальне домінування сьогодні вже неможливе. Очищення банківської системи призвело до того, що сьогодні наші банки вже працюють як трансмісійний механізм. Вони є, по суті, вони вже є реалізатором нашої монетарної політики. І тому, коли я чую в телевізорі обіцянки, що завтра кредитні кошти для бізнесу будуть по 3%, я задаю собі питання, а хто заплатить різницю? Так? Тому що не можна зруйнувати законів економіки. Вони є такими, якими вони є, і вони об'єктивні по відношенню до будь-кого з кандидатів. Сьогодні можна обіцяти що завгодно, але економіка працює так, як вона працює. Сьогодні ми вже не можемо використовувати державні банки для цілей того чи іншого уряду або тих чи інших бізнес-груп, тому що ми маємо сьогодні вже корпоративне управління в державних банках. Тому сьогодні будь-хто з кандидатів, який переможе на виборах, повинен це розуміти. І політика Національного банку заявлена і яка вже підтвердила свою результативність, говорить про те, що не лише змінилися правила, ні, змінилося середовище. Фінансове середовище змінилося, бізнес-середовище змінюється за ним. І це є свідченням незворотнього шляху реформ. І це є свідченням того, що популізм, він так і залишиться популізмом, можливо, з гаслами, але він ніколи вже не зможе зруйнувати те, що було досягнуто, і ніколи не зможе перешкодити тим економічним і фінансовим досягненням, які ми сьогодні бачимо.
Well, that's final. Thank you very much, Kateryna. Lajos, I mean, do you take those comments together as someone who knows the country extremely well, but has an external perspective, and has also been through the washing machine cycle on populism is not unknown to you. It's certainly affected, you in your career, and you've watched the politics of Hungary close off. We heard there a very strong statement there from Kateryna saying that, yes, there would be some sort of populist instincts, which seems to be pretty much a phenomenon in the region and beyond, but that things were robust enough to withstand it, that the government and the bank had achieved between them. Well, lots of people have said that things can't go backwards in this part of the world, and that's not always turned out to be the case, as you know, having arrived from Budapest. So are you as convinced? Thank you.
It's not for me to make comments on the capability of presidential candidates who would probably deliver what. But I think if there is really consensus behind the Western orientation of the country, then there is no choice but to continue the structural reforms. And just for the sake of discussion, let me highlight a few which I really feel are critical and crucial in order for Ukraine to advance and converge, at least with the Central and Eastern European countries. One is public debt management, and I look at my former student, Yuri Butsa, who is making an excellent job, and I'm proud, you see? There is an important impact of Central European University on the hearts and minds of Ukrainian people. Ukraine has a large exposure to foreign debt. And that's dangerous, that's risky, especially if we take into consideration that Nouriel Roubini, the famous American Professor Doom, already said that the next crisis is just around the corner, maybe 2020 or whatever. It doesn't matter when it comes, but there might be a situation whereby the external financing of Ukraine can be more in jeopardy, and as a consequence, one way to mitigate the risk is to foment and support more domestic savings. Domestic savings, especially in domestic currency, and use that for the financing of the inevitable fiscal deficit, which is not huge by any means, not even by Ukrainian standards, but you have to be prepared for a worsening situation. This is one important problem. Privatization. Some of my dear colleagues here mentioned that there has been notable advance in preparing a new privatization legislation, and more transparency has been into the process. Well, that's true. That is necessary, but far from sufficient. Privatization is much more than законодательство. So it has to go beyond that, and you have to go out the whole world and to market the opportunities what Ukraine has, because the Ukrainian state has a tremendous amount of assets which are captured by non-productive uses at this point in time. Now, Ukraine should look at the experience of the Central and Eastern European countries, where unemployment is very low at the moment, but there are reasons for that. One is the very high level of emigration. These countries, including mine, lost millions of people who went to the European Union. And as a consequence, now you can no longer rely on a model which was based on plenty of high quality labor at low wages. Maybe for a year or two, Ukraine can do that, but not for a long time. Now, how we can address that? There are at least two issues, and then many others. One is to promote productivity growth. So it's not only just investment per se and the enhancement of private businesses or the promotion of small and medium enterprises, but everywhere, how we promote more competitiveness and more productivity. And the second issue, which is again a reform coming back to the table of the government, education reform. We haven't mentioned education reform.
Which is taking place.
Yes, but you know.
Do you just want more of it, different quality of it, briefly, and then we'll...
Yeah, the more qualitative reforms in this respect. We all know that Ukraine has a tremendous reservoir or potential of high-quality people, and they are plucked and used by foreign businesses for everything which is in the framework of what we call science, technology, engineering, and math. But you have to have centers of excellence. You can't rely exclusively on what you have already as tradition or legacy of the past. We need to have more cross-fertilization of ideas, more openness in the scientific, technology, and educational field. There are many other things,
so we can open up the debate.
Yes, but I finish here.
Oh no, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Is there one last point? You're fine. Well, you can bring it up in the next round. You've been so patient, ladies and gentlemen. I know when you're sitting up here, time seems to go fast, and sometimes in a big audience it can seem to go slowly, despite the brilliance of our panel. And one of the things I often think helps is just to throw in a couple of questions. I know that there are roving microphones. Don't be shy. I think I'll take a couple and we'll see how that goes. If you could keep them general, not too much in the weeds of your own business or the politics, but just that would be useful to the whole panel. Who would like to put them on the spot? Give me a break. What have they done? Everybody's so satisfied. Is there anyone with any sort of question, challenge, comment? No? It is the most satisfied audience I think I've ever addressed. I'm a bit like one of those teachers who's just going to pick on someone in the end. Anyone at the back who'd just like to sort of stick a hand in the air and ask something? Well, that really has drawn a blank.
Can I, while people thinking...
yeah, it's a good idea. Like, why don't you all think about it?
No,
And there will be a prize. A large glass of wine will be bought personally by me for anyone who asks a question. Yes, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I just want to comment on while people thinking on the questions, because I think you should ask questions. This is a group of people who can give you a bit of glimpse on the politics a bit. But I want to answer one of the questions which was raised before. What's the priorities for the next president and the next government? It's economic growth. And economic growth, demography is a big question mark because of the immigration and what's the replenishment of the workforce here. But searching and discussing just the salary increases, as some politician quotes in Ukraine, it's not the solution. We need to look more into productivity. And I very much echo the productivity discussion in Ukraine, which is a big room for improvement. And also, it requires, in terms of policy changing policy in Ukraine requires 226 votes in the parliament. A lot of the reforms that took place, they've not been just done on the governmental level, they've been done through the laws. Reversing laws in the dispersed parliament requires a strong coalition and a strong position on some of the things to change. So the reforms that's been sealed in the law would be quite difficult to reverse, whatever the structure of the parliament is. And this is important to note. The same things, the more they are in the constitution, the more irreversible they are. It's much more difficult.
Well, I'm interested in that.
And education. Ukraine currently going through the big education reform. It's primary, secondary school reform, which put in a lot of focus on the knowledge development, as Ukraine been known as a strong country with a lot of STEM knowledge. But they also are putting a strong focus on their soft skills, such as leadership, teamwork, and creativity. And it's become a cornerstone of education reform, which is currently driven by Lilia Hrinevich in the parliament.
Lajos, I'm going to bring you back on that point. It's not the first time I've heard that reforms are irreversible. And I understand from the perspective of people who fought very hard, and on this panel here, and many at the event, to bring their countries forward, to make the kind of economic and policy reforms that would be beneficial to Ukraine, particularly in the difficult circumstances that the country has been in. It's very tempting to say this is irreversible. It's not always quite the case, is it? Because there is something often in the politics, in the sort of mood, which whatever is in the letter of the law or the constitution can turn out to be more vulnerable. Am I right to be a bit concerned about that?
No, you are absolutely right. You have many bad examples of countries which at one point in their history had undertaken very serious, very comprehensive, very profound and deep reforms. And then 20 years later, they made a reversal of that. Or on the other hand, you have countries which have known for at least 100 years what would be a kind of minimum set of reforms which would be required in order for them to converge. And they don't do that because for political reasons it is next to impossible. You go to Argentina, which at one point was one of the most developed countries on earth, and now it's in a constant crisis. Every decade you have a new president trying to do something, and still the country plunges back because of many, many reasons. I don't want to get into that because it is very far away from the Ukrainian experience. But even in Central and Eastern Europe, which I happen to know best, all of a sudden you can have a populist, nationalist stream or movement or political party or whatever winning election, and without having told the people that they would do this and that, they implement reversals of reforms. And if people do not realize that this is detrimental in the long run, they don't resist. And when they start realizing what happened, it is too late to resist. So Hungary is really one of the best examples in this respect. Just go no further than the pension reform. Hungary was one of the first to implement the so-called multi-pillar World Bank-y type of nice reform, whereby in addition to the pay-as-you-go system, you have also a private pension system based on private pension funds, which are, by the way, very good in terms of fostering and promoting domestic savings and investing in the stock market and having a stake in the future of the country for ordinary people and persons. 3 million people out of 10 opted for that in 1998 when it started. 20 years later, it was just closed down. And the whole amount of stocks and bonds which were already accumulated on individual accounts was confiscated by the government. What? Reforms are reversible.
I think there's a fantastic warning from recent history in that, and it's very good to hear that. Sometimes we look at an analysis of possibilities that is a bit too limited. I'm going to offer one last final offer to the audience to ask anything that they may regret afterwards not having asked. There is a hand. Love you already. Off you go, and then I say we'll take a little final round from the panel. So. Yeah, do you have a microphone, sir? It would be very helpful.
Great, Dmytro, thanks. Professor Bokros, since you were here a year ago, the labor migration, people moving out of Ukraine to Eastern Europe, has become quite dramatic. You just mentioned that you went through that problem in Hungary and, of course, nearby Poland 20 years ago. With that view, what recommendations would you have for Ukraine now to minimize the labor migration, to maybe encourage people to stay here, or to bring them back after they've worked for 2 or 3 years in Poland or Budapest?
Why don't you take that, and anyone else who'd like to come in on that, thank you, can do so. What would you recommend? Can't lock him up. Don't want to lock him in. How do we
No, of course
persuade them
not.
to stay?
Of course not. So don't get me wrong. My recommendation would not entail closing borders, because that would be nice for a dictatorship, but not for a liberal democracy which is based on the rule of law. Especially if Ukraine wants to join the EU. Then the future for Ukrainians is to have even more labor mobility rather than less. I think the government can do quite a few things to have a countervailing impact. And I'm not saying that emigration is unilaterally bad. No, it has pros and cons, it has positive and negative characteristics from the viewpoint of the country as such. But it is important for the government to realize that it's a brain drain, it's exportation of knowledge and resources and manpower. One reason why education reform is so important, that the quality of labor in Ukraine should be increased further. Privatization has to be pushed through very radically in order to have more investment, more jobs, more opportunities for people to stay at home. And let's face it, not all of those people who went to Poland, for example, went because they had just high salaries. They went because there were no opportunities here. So if the government can create many more good opportunities, good jobs, and help the private sector to create better jobs and better opportunities, and at the same time the standard of living increases and the whole atmosphere of Ukraine being a boom country can be created, then people would come back. It's not a one-way street. It's not like in the case of the Soviet Union that people left, they could never come back. That's no longer a dictatorship, and it's already happening both in Hungary and Poland. The people come back, not only because of Brexit, fortunately.
Can't blame Brexit for everything. Although it's quite convenient, actually, to do so, but it isn't the only driver. Alexander, we haven't heard from you for a little bit. What do you think? I mean, you know, your sector is one in which there's tremendous innovation. It attracts a lot of people who want to be very outward-looking and advance themselves. What would your recipe be for this, what was it, the boom? You had a nice phrase there, Lajos, the sort of a feeling of a boom mood around the country that would lure the brightest and best to stick around or come back.
I think the answer is just as my colleagues have said. The answer is in the growth. The answer in the growth in productivity. Speaking of the telecom sector, the tenders have been stimulating growth, and if you look at the statistics on the telecom sector, it has been stagnating prior to 2015 when we launched the tenders, and it has been growing ever since. So the answer to labor migration, the answer to many other things is the stimulation of growth. And I think this is what the next couple of years is about. We are moving from the phase of, well, let's say, stabilization, where we're moving from the phase of broken public financing, from the crisis in the banking sector. And a lot of things have been done by the NBU and my colleagues here, and the way to go is to stimulate growth, to stimulate the export, to stimulate the IT, to stimulate the services sector, to stimulate the gas production, and so on and so forth. So the simple answer is that we have to stimulate a growth of the economy.
Yeah, I'll just throw that straight to Kateryna, sort of stimulating the growth of the economy, obviously the magic words everyone wants to hear. What do you think that you need to do to progress that, or perhaps support this process more?
Ну, взагалі-то,
Well, in fact,
всі реформи, про які
all of the
сьогодні говорили мої
reforms which have been
колеги,
mentioned
вони
above
спрямовані, аби забезпечити зростання економіки. Це і не лише реформа фінансового сектору, це і ті реформи, які відбуваються в публічних фінансах, це і реформи, які є в нашому енергетичному секторі, це і приватизація, яка сьогодні вже розпочалася. Так, вона і мала приватизація, так, але вона є, і ми сподіваємося, що це буде продовжуватися. Це і реформа освіти, і реформа в сфері охорони здоров'я. Це дуже багато інших, можливо, не таких гучних, але ми повинні про них пам'ятати. Для економічного зростання, для забезпечення економічного зростання, що необхідно? Ну, в першу чергу, необхідна макрофінансова стабільність. І сьогодні ми її вже досягли, і ми мусимо, і ми її втримаємо. Тому що без цього не можна говорити ні про яке зростання. Далі, для економічного зростання потрібні інвестиції. І ми говоримо не тільки про зовнішні, але й про внутрішні інвестиції. І не лише про, скажімо, матеріальні ресурси, але й про інтелектуальні ресурси, про готовність бізнесу інвестувати свій час і свої зусилля для розвитку. Для цього, звичайно, потрібно продовжити і імплементувати судову реформу. Це дуже важливо. Всі говорили і говорять, і минулого року ми говорили про це, що нам необхідна нормальна правова держава, нам необхідні умови для того, аби бізнес почувався безпечно і міг нормально прогнозувати свою діяльність. Дещо сьогодні вже зроблено для цього, і я не можу не сказати, що той закон, який так довго ми на нього очікували, було прийнято, і це закон про захист прав кредиторів. Це дуже важливий крок, який спрямований на захист інвестицій в першу чергу, і наше завдання далі його правильно і остаточно імплементувати, аби забезпечити захист інвестиціям, судова реформа.
Так, Kateryna, I'm going to, if I could, to stop you there, because there's quite a lot in there to take on board at the end of our session. Dmytro, last thought to you, word we haven't really heard there very much, if at all, this morning, is corruption and the ongoing debate about NABU and about the anti-corruption authorities. There was a good piece, I think, that The Atlantic ran a couple of days ago, saying that the worries about political influence or business influence over the anti-corruption drive is still something that is putting people off Ukraine as an investment destination, and of course very bad internally, because you've got money going places it shouldn't be. How optimistic can you make us that this is really progressing in an orderly direction, and it's not just the same story as I heard last year, just 360-something days on?
Thank you. I just want to briefly answer the previous one, also the small comment. Do we have the brain drain or the people going internationally? Yes, we do. And I think denial of this, but the same happened in Poland, same happened in Romania, same happened in Hungary when they join the EU and the open borders take place. Are they coming back? Some yes, some no. I just give you a perspective of high-tech sector. The compensation levels in Ukraine are almost the same, or actually the same, as in Poland and in Spain. But the cost of living and taxing burden in these countries is much higher than in Ukraine. So a lot of people actually reconsidering their presence in these countries because the cost of living and the things that they can get in Ukraine versus some of the European states are much better. And they're reconsidering what the opportunities they can have, and this is already taking place. There's this two-way street. We still haven't answered demography question and where we will replenish the population of Ukraine. And Poland did a pretty good strategic decision to solve the refugee crisis with Ukrainians versus Syrians, creative. I think we need to look for the similar creative things, because already now some of the companies are looking for high talented Russians who actually are extremely unhappy with all the crap that is taking place in Russia. And they are already going and considering employment here in Ukraine versus understanding that the Ukrainians has much more perspective for their personal growth and personal development than the closed borders and sealed things in Russia. And it's really something that we need to put on the table. Considering corruption, I think that I would highly prefer not to comment the clashes between law enforcement agencies. I think when you look at every single country in the world that's been establishing new law enforcement agencies, these new enforcement agencies race for the big fish, and in this race they generally collide. And having a strong, vibrant civil society, strong media in Ukraine, that's ensuring that the focus on anti-corruption efforts remains. Do I believe in a lot of people behind jail? No. It's a very high competition between 3 agencies and more for this race, but we already have seen results. My preference in the policy making was always in the changing of the processes. Things like Prozoro, like transparency, the new governance, the governance of the National Bank, the new regulator, this is the principles that could be put in place, eliminating corruption in the roots of corruption, then catching and playing the whack-a-mole game. That's why changing the processes, putting more transparency in place, working civil society and strong independent media, this is what is the best antidote for corruption. And I want to remind that last week in the US conference, there was a very interesting statement from one of the investments. They invest in the countries where is manageable corruption. I still haven't heard what manageable corruption means, but I think this is a question to investors, how they define this.
That is a very good question on which to end. We are actually going to have the investment view coming up. So first of all, give your thanks to the panel for being so enlightening. Stay put, not long to lunch. We're just going to swap around a bit and you're going to hear the view, the investment view for the next 45 minutes. Thank you very much, panel.